The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
I rise today to give my contributions on these bills that's before this House and to put my views out there, Mr. Speaker, so that it will be on the record. Because oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, persons seek to misconstrue what it is one believes after one would have spoken. But before I go there, Mr. Speaker, I want it to be said that as a believer, as Luke said in Acts, quoting the Apostle Paul, in him I live and move and have my being. Mr. Speaker, as one of the Christian hymn writers at the turn of the century wrote, I want it to also be said in this House that it is well with my soul.
Preach, boy, preach. Keep preaching, my brother.
The scriptures goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, that I will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on him. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Solomon the Wise wrote some nearly 3,000 years ago, after having lived and done everything under heaven. The scriptures report that he was the second wisest man to have ever lived, Christ being the wisest. He said, fear God, keep his commandment. He said after having summed up the whole matter, after having lived and did everything under the sun, that to fear God and keep his commandments, that this is the whole duty of man. So, Mr. Speaker, I begin there. Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the year, I embarked on a journey. As a believer, the scripture says that if you are a leader among your people, one of the things that you should do is that you should begin to write out the whole law of God. And in January, Mr. Speaker, I began to do just that. Genesis, and halfway through Exodus. And it is instructive because as I went through Exodus, I ended up at a place where the whole discussion of a constitution came up. And the reality of my research, Mr. Speaker, was that the first constitution ever written, ever spoken to, is found in the pages of that good book. And every constitution thereafter, Mr. Speaker, is a reflection of that constitution. As a matter of fact, it is so precise that it starts off with a preamble. And the preamble, Mr. Speaker, is this: I am the Lord your God that brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Based on that, that is the wellspring from which everything else will now flow. And then he goes on and he gives them the articles of their constitution, which we have as 10. He says, have no other God before me. Don't make any graven image. Don't take my name in vain. And then he goes on to 4 and he says, honor your father and mother, which is the foundation of all Western law when it comes to familial relationship. Then he goes on to the other 6. Don't steal from your neighbor. Don't take his property. Don't take his wife. Don't kill him. And that is the relation for all other laws. As a matter of fact, all 10 of those laws can be reduced to 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second, like unto the first, your neighbor as yourself. Those last ones. And all of those 2 can be reduced to 1, which is this: he who loves fulfills the whole law. And Mr. Speaker, in my research, I'm not a lawyer. I started law school, and 2 years into it, in the United States, my wife said, now listen, you're an engineer, you need to go find yourself a job. And so, I abandoned that pursuit to ensure the security of my family. And Mr. Speaker, a constitution is what is known as apodatic law. It is simply law which says what is right action within a society and within the context of a people. A-P-O-D-I-C-T-I-C. Apodatic law. And from apodatic law, Mr. Speaker, we get the causatic law, which is, if you don't do this within your society, if this, then that. And so we see that whole flow throughout the scriptures, and indeed that is how we have constructed our laws. We have a preamble from which we say is the wellspring from which all of the other articles of our Constitution will evolve. We put in there that we have an abiding respect for Christian values and the rule of law. We say we're not going to allow anybody to deprive us of our freedoms. We're not going to let anybody put us back into slavery. We speak about industry and loyalty in there. And then we go on and we put the apodatic principles. So what we consider right within the context of the Bahamas. And from those apodatic principles, then we went on in this parliament to create causatic laws. If you don't do this, then that. Excuse me.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Take it easy.
Go ahead,
Take
brother.
it easy.
But that's a sign. Go ahead.
Amen. Baptize you.
Go ahead. Thank you, my brother. Thank you, my brother.
I believe we may, after this, we may go through a
You
baptism.
might have to be baptized again.
Mr. Speaker,
Baptized by fire this time.
after one would have established those causatic laws, we, Mr. Speaker, have to decide in terms of apodatic law what is right. And when one does that, Mr. Speaker, one comes down on one or the other side of the fence. The member for South Beach brought up the whole issue of natural law. And Mr. Speaker, there's only two real philosophical thinkings. You're either someone who believes in natural law, which means that rights originate from some absolutisms, which usually results in what a divine being had to say, quote unquote God, or what you observe in nature as to what he constructed. Or you and I, Mr. Speaker, under what is called positive law, divorced and separated from any sort of divine command to do anything. You and I can get together, Mr. Speaker, on any given day and decide what is good, what is right. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the member for Marcos City put it this way. He said, and the prophet Micah stated very clearly, he says, he has shown you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. That's a natural law thinking. Positive law says, Mr. Speaker, me and you can get together and we can decide tomorrow that green is pink. And pink really should be blue. Divorced from any sort of moral hinge pin. Mr. Speaker, I am a natural law fellow. Not in the vein as South Beach have quoted, because you have some natural law thinkers such as Locke and Humes and others. And I agree with Locke and Humes as it pertains to how human governments was established. They helped create the whole idea of a democracy. But I do not share their view as to the equality of men and women. They were behind the times in that particular understanding. I am a natural law fellow more in the vein of someone such as William Wilberforce, or the great Christian theologian and preacher Charles Spurgeon, or even in the thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian who gave us some very Interesting thinking. And Mr. Speaker, let me say something about Bonhoeffer, because, as I said, sometimes people misconstrued what you say. Because you see, Bonhoeffer, in the time of the Nazis, also after his thinking came to the conclusion that Hitler had to be assassinated because, in the vein of what had happened, that it was his moral and spiritual duty to do that. As a believer, I don't believe that. So I don't want nobody going on Facebook and reading the views of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in that regard and ascribing them to me. Because I believe in a democracy, Mr. Speaker. A Christian ought to be able to stand up, express his views, and to be able to get the majority of persons to move forward with him. And if it cannot happen and the society decides that it will go another way, you have two choices. You can leave or stay. But one ought never take up arms in a democracy. So let me state that. Because, you know, in this social age, with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, all sorts of interesting things happen. So, Mr. Speaker, going from that position, I want to say unequivocally that I believe in the equality of men and women. And I don't want anyone out there to try and make me a standard bearer of inequality in that regard. I support bills 1, 2, and 3. Unequivocally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see, as the member for Marco City said, that there's a provision put in there for the retroactivity back to 1973. But I'm not one who's hard and fast and willing to say, I won't move forward with that. But, Mr. Speaker, in regards to bill number 4, and really we ought to decide whether the whip is on in this circumstance, because the member for Engliston said that the whip was not ordered. This is a matter of conscience. Others may have indicated that the whip is on. If the whip is on, well, I was the deputy whip, so if the whip is on, that means the two of us ought to be whipping. And for us to not support any particular thing, I can't speak for the member for Fort Charlotte, he'll speak for himself. And everyone knows he's more than able to do that. So we would have to clarify that, Mr. Speaker, because a potential vote has implications.
Every vote has
Potential.
Some other ones.
Yeah, article.
Mr. Speaker, we said that Article 4 is the global provision. Mr. Speaker, we said that Article 4 is the global provision that makes 1, 2, and 3 all good. And if that is our intent, and I don't believe that it is not our intent, I believe that we ought to do just that. But we ought to clarify it in a way, Mr. Speaker, that makes that clear. That is to give rights to men and women. You know, Mr. Speaker, we talk about the fact that Article 15 in our Constitution mentions sex, but it's not reproduced in Article 26. And there are those who've already argued that, you know, the whole term of sex in 1972 and 1973 has been redefined by the courts in Europe, the European Court.
Redefined by our court.
And we know, Mr. Speaker, we have, well, if it's not, then I stand to be corrected. The member from Marco City had quoted something in that regard, but we'll see what the deputy has to say in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, we know that our Privy Council, which is our highest court in Great Britain, has already done, I don't want to speak disparaging of the court, but it has done a number on the Bahamian people in regards to what they truly desire, in regards to capital punishment, which is another thing in our Constitution. It doesn't make, and it doesn't help matters in this discussion for the leading proponent of the LGBT community in the Bahamas to come out and say, we wait for these bills. Doesn't help the discourse. if the equality for men and women is what we are after. But you know, Mr. Speaker, whether I've heard from the floor that that's not what she said. I've heard that my dear Deputy Prime Minister, my leader, next to my leader, said that the law does not say that in Europe. And I accept that. I was about to make a statement, but I won't get myself in no more trouble. Eh? I can stay focused. Because, above all else, Mr. Speaker, I have always been a servant. But, Mr. Speaker, I will say this. Let's go to what the Commission says on that issue. See, because I'm not a lawyer. I didn't get past the second year. But I can read what the Commission said. On page 130 of their report, they say, while the majority of persons who made presentation to the Commission or presented views at town meetings were clearly of the opinion that there should be no discrimination in respect to the rights between men and women, there were deeply divided and conflicted views on the effect of including sex as a ground in Article 26. In particular, there was a fear that the interpretation of sex, interpolation of sex into Article 26 would open the door for constitutional interpretations to embrace other collateral rights, such as same-sex marriage and the recognition of rights for lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgendered. This was opposed by many persons as being fundamentally repugnant to the establishment of moral code. And indeed, to guard against such a possibility, there were calls for constitutional protection to be given to the institution of marriage, which we will address later. They go on in the very next paragraph to say, indeed, similar concerns have been agitated in neighboring countries, which led them to take a radically different approach. An example is provided by the recent experience of Jamaica, which out of similar fears that such a ground would provide fodder for constitutional challenges to other laws which discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation, Jamaica took the novel approach of using the terms being male or female as opposed to sex. Now, Mr. Speaker, I heard my good friend, the member for Central and South Eleuthera, speak to what has been established in the Eastern Caribbean. And he rightfully spoke to the fact that many countries in the Eastern Caribbean, unlike the Bahamas, still have relations between men and men and relations between men and women, as against between women and women, it's against the law, with 20-year sentences. So I would presuppose that if they put sex in their constitution, saying that the very act itself is illegal in their country, constitutional challenges in that regard would be problematic. We, Mr. Speaker, in our enlightened thinking in this country, in 1991, and every member of that then parliament voted to remove those vestiges from our law. So it's not illegal for individuals to be within the confines of their own homes and do whatever they want with consenting adults. We're in a different paradigm. And so, Mr. Speaker, but we have examples also of those states in the Eastern Caribbean. And Mr. Speaker, the Commission goes on to further say, to further guard against the possible infiltration of developing jurisprudence on same-sex marriages and legal systems. One such country, more formally St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's the guiding principles of state policy included in its 2000 draft constitution provided for the protection of marriage and affirmation that marriage is a legal union between a person who is biologically male at birth and a person who's biologically female at birth. Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is truly our intent as a government to not have this debate become a debate about gay marriage. I believe that. I believe that we desire truly to balance the scales between men and women. And Mr. Speaker, I say if that is the case, given the fears of the Bahamian people, given their suspicion of us, their lack of trust of their politicians, we should acquiesce and give them language for which will not cause them to think twice about supporting the rights of men and women in this country. The equality of such. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate that given the fact that there's still some swirling out there in regard to this word sex, that I can support 1, 2, and 3, but without amendments, I cannot support 4. You know, Mr. Speaker, I was going to talk about my desire to see the Bahamas become a republic, but, you know, you've sort of said that we need to have this relevance debate. I wanted to address that, but we'll come back to that at another point in time. But you know, Mr. Speaker, as a believer, and you know, Mr. Speaker, I ain't no perfect fella. I'll be the first to tell you that.
Nobody perfect.
Well, he who loves is perfect, according to the scriptures, but you're right, ain't none of us perfect. And Mr. Speaker, I go before my God every day, because the scripture says his mercies are new every morning. So Jeremiah said. But Mr. Speaker, I believe that the good Lord has said to us that in regards to life and how we live and how we operate, whether it be on a governmental level, whether it be on how we live in union with each other, he said that today I put before you life and death, blessings and cursings. But he never just gives us the choice, you know. He always tells us what to choose. He said, choose life that you and your children may live. And he said, and if you do so, if you are willing and obedient, you will eat the fat of the land. And Mr. Speaker, with that, Bamboo Town supports 1, 2, and 3. But I'd like to see us do something with 4. I take my seat.